welcome to Cambridge Common Writers' virtual book launch for Nada Samih-Rotondo's All Water Has Perfect Memory. Again, my name is Michael Mercurio. I am the Executive Director of Cambridge Common Writers. Cambridge Common is an alumni organization for the Lesley University Low Residency MFA program in creative writing. I am an alum, Nada is an alum, and perhaps you are also an alum or a future alum. We are thrilled to host Nada tonight. I was saying before we got started that I've been waiting to say this for a while. With this debut memoir, Nada is firmly entrenched in the ranks of incredible Palestinian authors, from Mahmoud Darwish to Naomi Shihab Nye, and you are going to hear incredible prose that tells a true story that can change the world. That's one of the things that is so wonderful about Nada's writing. You will believe and you will understand how writing can change the world. A little bit later on, Nada will be joined by Susan Tassent, who Nada describes as her first reader, which is a special relationship that authors have with readers. So we are going to start tonight with Nada reading from the book, then go to the conversation, and then open it up for Q&A with you, the audience. So Nada, I am going to turn the spotlight fully on you so that you can blow us away.
Such high praise. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining. This is my first official Zoom. I'm going to be reading from the chapter called The Silent Period. This is in Rhode Island, 1990. It was late September 1990 when my mother and I arrived in New York. Raindrops pitter-pattered against my bus window in the dark until we drove under street lamps and the white lights sent shimmers across the glass like moonbeams on the sea. I was 6.5 and I had spent the last month traveling out of Kuwait. We drove through Iraq on the way to Jordan. Eventually, I boarded my first plane to London, where we stopped to change flights before crossing the ocean to New York. I shrieked with excitement when I found a tiny box of cornflakes in our hotel room in New York. Cereal was a treat in Kuwait. American products were present, but not widespread yet. We didn't linger in the city long. We boarded a smaller plane to TF Green Airport in Rhode Island. It was my first time traveling. I would not take a plane again for another 14 years when I went back over the Atlantic Ocean to Cairo. At age 6, I was curious and full of questions. With frizzing thick hair pulled back in a half-hearted ponytail, its first encounter with humidity. My thick eyebrows were connected and my lanky limbs quickly outgrew my clothes. My little body was all sharp corners and right angles, a small oval face with pointy ears sticking out. I was jet-lagged, my night and day inverted, but happy to be on an adventure with my mom. I knew we were coming to America and I was aware that my mom was taking me far away. I remember noticing the tension with other adults around us in Amman, but I didn't comprehend the scope of my mother's actions and would not for a long time to come. For now, I was fully and wholeheartedly in the moment. I noticed the differences between the tiny plane we boarded to Rhode Island and the big one we flew on the day before across the Atlantic. I was relieved that it was a short ride, a little over an hour, and I was excited to be greeted in the airport by my older uncle's pretty American fiance, a young, dark-haired Italian-American woman who eagerly presented me with new Barbie dolls and stuffed animals. Bodies of water have a way of bringing people together. Mama was the third and youngest girl born between my uncles, sandwiched between an older possessive brother who took his role as the head of the household after their father passed a little too seriously, and a younger brother who stole away to the United States right after high school to tail his brother. My younger uncle studied in Bristol, the same town on Narragansett Bay where my future husband grew up. While Kuwait lay in the northeast corner of the Arabian Peninsula, the town of Bristol was also situated on a peninsula, 13 miles southeast of the capital city of Providence. I imagine my uncle felt the same pull to the water that I did a few years later. As a Roger Williams University student, he attended classes steps away from gleaming Narragansett Bay. He traveled over Mount Hope Bridge, a two-lane historic suspension bridge that sits 135 feet above the water, to gather with friends in the bustling city of Newport. The wide expanse of open sky greeted him as he first met his future wife, a young American woman attending college nearby. Like countless couples before and after them, they made plans strolling along those rocky shores. It was their union that made Rhode Island an option for my mom. My mom was just in Rhode Island the year before to attend their wedding. It was a lavish 80s affair, complete with the electric slide and big hair, but lacking in alcohol as per Muslim tradition, a repeated lament if you ever sat next to my American aunt's relatives long enough. When the Rhode Island landscape was familiar to my mom, she never stopped calling it Jannah or heaven. These Americans live in Jannah and they have no idea, she used to say when we walked along the wooded roads in those early days. We were driven northwest from the airport in Warwick to the town of North Scituate, where the house we would stay in was located. My younger uncle's new wife had an aunt named Janet, who I later learned was not actually related, was just a close friend of the family for decades. She had a country house on the main road right outside the village, which had a recent vacancy that very day. While it was the middle of the night to me, to everyone else, it was the afternoon. Right at the exact moment we pulled into the driveway, a young blonde woman in a fluffy white tulle gown, surrounded by other formally dressed people, was being stuffed into a long white limo parked on the grass. The air smelled of lemony pine needles, wet earth, and tree bark, scents I had never experienced before. In fact, everything felt new and unfamiliar to me. The rain-soaked soil, the houses that reminded me of Lego sets with their shingles and pitched roofs, and most of all, the English language, foreign sounds with rough edges and unusual tones. It's her wedding day, my mama explained as we walked up to the house carrying everything left of our life and a couple of suitcases. I was led down a walkway to the back door, which opened into an airy, light-filled kitchen. Apparently, someone had draped a giant welcome home banner along the kitchen walls, which my mom translated to me because I could not read or speak English yet. I remember spending a few moments with our benefactor, Auntie Janet, in the kitchen, and it was translated to me that we had the house to ourselves for a few hours since everyone was off to her daughter's wedding. The sign was to help welcome us, she explained, because this was our new home. I assumed she was being hospitable and I smiled, not fully grasping how the currents of my life had shifted forever. The two-story house, which we lived in for about a year, sat on the main road but was surrounded by an expanse of rolling lawns and towering trees. Instead of Kuwait's towering beige buildings, dusty parking garages, and groups of screeching children, Scituate was green. There were still no children in sight, but I made the most of it, assuming we were just visiting and would be back to familiar territory eventually. Even though I was the only child to run through the house in many years, since Auntie Janet's daughters were in their 20s, I was treated as a welcome, if only a bit disruptive addition to the household. My tita made herself right at home, especially in the kitchen. She continued to cook and serve my favorite dishes with familiar ingredients my uncle would get for us from the Middle East market. I grew accustomed to eating at the round kitchen table, but even after that same table hosted my 7th birthday party with new friends, I was still under the impression that my time in America was temporary. A second language learner moves through 5 stages of language acquisition. Immediately upon arrival to my new first grade classroom in North Scituate Elementary School, I fell into the silent period, the first stage. For several weeks, I went through the motions of riding the bus to school, sitting in class, coloring, listening to the clatter of sounds around me emerging from classmates and teachers, playing outside on the playground, and riding the bus back to the country house, all without saying a word to anyone. My classmates were all smiles and warmth towards me. but I didn't have the language to participate in their recess games or follow along in the classroom. I was the only English language learner in the school, and the district did not have any English as second language teachers. By the time they were able to get one from the next town over, it was months later, and I had acquired enough English to get by. Silent period notwithstanding, my first grade teacher was kind and responsive. She often asked me to translate words and numbers to Arabic to help me share my culture with the other students. She even allowed me to do a science presentation on the solar system by saying the names of planets in Arabic. She was a bit disappointed to learn that some planets shared the same name in both languages. The other students were welcoming and curious about the strange new girl in their town. As I picked up more English, making friends was easy, and I often was invited to friends' houses. A classmate once even gifted me a clear quartz crystal that took my breath away. It was the size of my entire palm, a pointy, clear crystal with several smaller crystals clustered around it. I was mesmerized, studying the rainbows it sent across the sunny window on the bus ride home. When I handed it back to her, she refused and said it was a gift. And besides, I have plenty more at home. It was a treasure that I was convinced either made me rich or the newest target of a vengeful pirate ghost. I spent my time drawing Ninja Turtle cards to give out to friends the next day. Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles was my favorite new show in America, but I also spent hours watching Punky Brewster, The World of David the Gnome, and Captain Planet. I credit 90s television with how fast I learned to communicate in English. When I learned to read in English, Dr. Seuss's Green Eggs and Ham was the first book I read by myself, which the adults made a big deal about. I spent what felt like entire days playing outside in the yard, never tiring of gathering pine cones and fallen branches of pine needles, which seemed as abundant as the water here. My first encounters with this new land were memorable. Nothing like the arid heat of Kuwait. Rhode Island's air seemed to be consistently saturated with moisture. I delighted at the changing leaves in the fall, in the numerous banded woolly bear caterpillars that were so furry I felt confident picking them up to pet. There were families of Canadian geese and mallard ducks by the reservoir a few minutes' walk across the road, along with my favorite, turtles. One day I was playing outside, coloring the inside of a large cardboard box that was to be my clubhouse, when I heard another child across the yard. There were a handful of small country homes nearby, their driveways connected by a dirt road that shared the yard with Janet's house. The sound of a child's voice was coming from the closest house. Mallory was my age and was visiting her grandparents for the weekend. We were fast friends and played together whenever she visited. We would run around outside collecting acorns, which we arranged artfully on a bed of moss I dubbed animal cake, an offering to the multitude of squirrels, blue jays, and robins. The last, I soon learned, lay tiny blue eggs, which surely made them magical. On rainy days, we would sit in her grandparents' kitchen coloring or rifling through her grandma's old cookie tin filled with buttons. Her grandmother was kind, warm, and welcoming. Her grandfather, bound to a wheelchair and rarely seen, was a mystery to me. When he was present, he was silent. I remember questioning whether he was dead or sleeping. I had seen my fair share of elderly people in Kuwait, but they were nothing like him. Our grandpas and grandmas were rarely sitting and never silent. The house smelled like crushed pine cones, wet earth, and wood smoke. I remember spending a long time going through that tin of buttons. It was filled to the brim with the most extraordinary buttons, every color and shape imaginable. Buttons that shimmered and glittered, and buttons shaped like hearts or stars. Mallory and I forged through the tin regularly, choosing our favorites. Hers was a rotary phone, and mine was a miniature pair of scissors. They were shiny silver with tiny points that tapered to dulled edges. It felt so daring and adventurous to run my finger along its smooth edge, imagining each time that it might suddenly transform into a sharp edge and puncture my skin. I was convinced that in any moment, in my next inhale, matter would shift, molecules would rearrange, and reality would radically change. It mesmerized me when it didn't. I was convinced it was only a matter of time before it did. Can ya McCann, it was or was not. During the first voyage of Sinbad the Sailor, Sinbad and his crew found themselves fleeing an island that was, in fact, a whale. The enormous whale had remained afloat in the same spot for so long that sand and soil had settled onto his exposed back. Soon, seeds took root and a lush landscape of trees and flowers grew over top of the whale's body, disguising the whale as an island. When Sinbad's crew started fires on its back to cook their meals, the whale started to stir, annoyed at being woken. Before long, the giant whale thrashed and flipped around in the water, sending Sinbad and his crew into great waves that washed them further away. I once imagined the shore of the Scituate Reservoir was the back of a giant whale. I approached it for a closer look and noticed the wide fan of a tail moving ever so softly up and down. It was still breathing. "Are you hurt?" I asked the whale as I ran my eyes along its massive body, searching for injuries. I looked up toward the path and noticed how close we were to the road. "Has anyone else noticed you? Do you need help?" The whale grunted, sending a few stray barnacles scattering around the muddy shores around him. He was smooth-skinned and gray, with black piercing eyes and a kind voice. I imagined he spoke back to me softly, saying, "Child, it is no use. They cannot see what is right under their feet. I have been here a long time. Eventually the waters will rise and I will move along." The water was dull and murky like the sky. The air smelled of rotting leaves and wet moss. Tall reeds grew alongside the water's edge, hiding croaking frogs. Iridescent dragonflies fluttered nearby, and tiny minnows scattered when I stepped near the water. The sound of passing cars remained in the background. I spotted a small family of mallard ducks curiously watching me from the water's edge, beside a yellow sign that warned trespassers of the protected watershed area. The whale's body continued to softly move up and down as I splashed him with water. "How did you get here?" The kind-hearted whale laughed softly, reminding me of my grandfather, still in Kuwait. "A long time ago, back in the time before time, the original inhabitants of this land stewarded the forests and waterways for many centuries. Some were called the Narragansett, or people of the small point. There were also the Wampanoag, the people of the first light, and the Nipmunk, the people of the freshwater. They often traveled to Council Tree Woods, which is off Route 101 in Scituate. Do you know that road?" "No, sorry, I don't drive yet." "No matter. In those woods lies the famous council tree. In the spring of 1915, the Nipmunk people met with other tribes in the area and heard the same news that had been spreading among the white man. A bill was passed that—" "What's a bill?" It's a law, and please just listen, no interrupting." I motioned that I locked up my mouth and threw away the key. "So in 1915, a law passed that would drown a large part of the town of Scituate. The Nipmunk people heard this news along with everyone else and decided it was best to move along. The townspeople, however, were descendants of the original European settlers in this land, and they didn't take this news too well. For over 200 years, European settlement grew along the Poneganyset, Masquinskake, and Patuxet rivers. Settlements grew into villages, and those villages were homes to families and schools, churches and mills, farms and train stations. The village names were Rockland, Ashland, South Scituate, Richmond, and Kent. I sat motionless, carefully following the whale's story, which was filled with strange words and unfamiliar names. All those villages are now underwater. We are sitting along the shores of the village of Kent, now 87 feet underwater. My eyes moved toward the middle of the pond, imagining ruins under the water. Helen O'Larson was a girl born and raised in the lost village of Rockland. Her grandmother, Susan Taylor, was Nipmunk. Her son, Raymond Wolfe, wrote a book, The Lost Villages of Scituate, recounting Helen's experiences and the history of the reservoir. Within the book, Helen remembered how the people of the village reacted to the sudden news. The city lawyer tried to buy one elderly man's home. He reportedly said he was born there and would die there, so he cut his throat and died in his bedroom alone. She also talked about how the homes were taken, even those on higher ground, because the land was being transformed into a watershed. Like being taken back in time, Helen and other residents watched helplessly as power lines were taken down, trolley service was halted, and roads were flooded along with the Providence and Danielson Railroad. 1,500 graves were exhumed and moved to other sites, while trees were transplanted along the new waterfront to protect the reservoir. It took 10 years to complete the project. Today, more than half of the state of Rhode Island gets its water from the reservoir. The water came, and now the land is silent. I imagined it was the whale that shared the story of the land as I read about it. I imagined the water level rising and climbing higher. Soon it covered the whale's massive tail, submerging him. He wriggled free of the lake bed and sputtered air from his blowhole, signaling farewell. All that was left was the sound of raindrops plunging into the reservoir and the mournful croaking of frogs. As a young girl, I loved sitting by the fireplace to play with that tin of buttons, wood smoke lingering in my hair long after I'd left. One gray day after Mallory left for the week, I noticed I forgot my box of crayons in her grandparents' kitchen. Having just been inside, I knew exactly where I left them on the table, but I felt a surge of anxiety as I stood outside the door. I had never actually been in the house without Mallory and felt like a fish out of water. I quickly became aware of the limited words I knew in the English language to describe my situation and the way my unfamiliar voice drowned in my heavy accent. My foreignness became clearer to me with each heartbeat. What if I got confused? What if they were angry at me? I really wanted to get my crayons back, so I steadied myself, took a deep breath, and opened the door into the kitchen. In a flash, I snatched the box of crayons, but right as I got to the door, Mallory's grandpa suddenly appeared in the hallway in his wheelchair. He grunted and gestured with his hands, wheeling closer to where I stood rooted like an oak. His pale eyes were insistent and pleading, flailing arms communicating in a language I couldn't translate. Like me, he was struggling with his words, drowning in silence. Crayons, I sputtered in my heavy English, holding up the box for him to see. My heart beat wildly in my chest as I opened the screen door and let it slam closed behind me, not looking back. That was silent period.
Nada, that was so great. I I kept thinking, this is the part I love most. This is the part I love most. And then you would just keep reading, and there would be another part that would come along and just knock me back. I love the whale. I love that sort of dose of magical realism that juxtaposes your experience and the experience of the people of that land. I just absolutely was stunned by that. It's such a beautiful, beautiful way to do that. And I mentioned this in the chat. I spent my college years in Rhode Island, and I really love how perfect and spot on your descriptions of that very special state are. So um, I am going to turn things over now to Susan so that the two of you can have a conversation, following which we will open things up for Q&A with the audience. So now I shall get myself out of here.
Yeah, I felt the same way about, I love that part. I love that part. And that wonderful moment of triumph when you find the word crayons. It was just very satisfying. And the poignancy of the connection between the grandfather and the young girl, and both are for different reasons, but struggling for that same moment of expression. It's a wonderful moment, and many moments in the book are wonderful. I'm so excited for you. First of all, congratulations on getting it out into the world.
Thank you.
So a couple of questions. My first question, I think, is I was going to frame it as why water, but it's really how water. I mean, the water, from the title through is a through line, and for obvious reasons. So it's not why so much as how you came to it. Was it the first thing you were thinking of, and that organized the book, or did you sort of start writing the story, the memories, and
That's a good question. So I always had the theme of water in the back of my mind as something that's very generative. That Toni Morrison quote definitely came to me very early on. I've had that in my notebooks forever. But then when I really started to think about it, it was just like so many connections, branching into other connections, branching into other connections. And I'm glad how you like framed it, like it's not just the why, it's the how, because it's not just playing with the theme of water, but it's like how water flows. There's just like elements of what water does and how water moves that also, I think, mirrored my thinking and writing process. Because it's like when we write about memory, it's not always linear. When we write about trauma, it's obviously not linear. So it's like in that way, water also, I think, was very reflective.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. It's interesting that you had it in mind right from the start. It was sort of a guiding principle for you, and that makes sense. That a connected thought to that, listening to your answer, is there's a point where you're talking about sleep as one of the basic biological needs. And I know that all living creatures need air, food, shelter, water, room to move, and each other, but I hadn't really thought about adding sleep as a seventh need. And I was thinking about sleep in terms of, parenting for sure, having young children. And then just sleep, if you're sleeping at a strange new place, or you're sleeping when you're worried about something the next day. But I was thinking about sleep. So I read that, and it caught me that moment. It's just a sort of a passing remark that you make about it in the narrative. And it made me think, so there's something that we need basic rest. It's like sort of the opposite of the rage creature that you have, you learn to live with, I guess. And that was a good lesson for me to read that too. I loved reading that. That's why I want you as my high school friend if I go back to high school, because I like your rage creature. It seems like that would be really helpful to have a friend who has a rage creature. It's like having a friend who's growing zucchini. You don't have to do it yourself, but you get some of the zucchini, but not too much zucchini. But I was thinking about sleep in terms of healing and restoring. And then I was thinking about water doing that. And then I was thinking about, when does water have to get quiet, and those wonderful moments where you're teaching your children to not be afraid of the ocean, and to not, and yes, Rhode Island definitely is the ocean state, which is great. I saw that in the chat. It's another connection, right? I mean, and the peninsula, I'm in Rhode Island now, and I grew up in Brooklyn. So when I moved to Rhode Island in 1984, I thought I was leaving the country, honestly. It was one of the first things I saw was the Nairobi sign, which is a local. And I thought, wow, Rhode Island has really interesting words. I didn't know it was stood for Nick, Ron, and Pete, who were the owners of one of the big furniture places in Rhode Island. So it was a little bit. It smelled different than Brooklyn did, for sure. So it's kind of cool to I know Nairobi, right? It seems so exotic and wonderful. But that's the power of language too. So my question is, thinking about water and thinking about sort of the soothing part of sleep and the restorative part of sleep, and connected to your narrative. You have these wonderful moments, and they seem to come as if out of nowhere, but they're perfectly placed. Descriptions of nature, and just the birds and the flowers and the water and I'm just wondering, what that was like to sort of know. When was that intuitive? Was that something you added in, or did it feel, how'd you get those in there? They're so beautiful.
Thank you so much. That's such a good question. So there are some memories that like they're so compounded by like time and space that like there's certain like elements of them, right, that I associate with certain parts of either like certain weather, or okay, this was a certain season, or there were definitely like robins here, there were definitely dandelions here. Like it was just, that's just like the associative way like my memory works. So I just like, that's how I think it first came to me. But a lot of it, once I started to do that, it was almost like using our metaphor again, floodgates, and just kind of like kept coming. And then it was after that, like very intuitive.
They work, they're beautiful. They give the reader, they ground us in space and time, as you're saying, and season, and locale, right? And they also help you highlight, not highlight, emphasize, make us aware of the difference between a desert setting and, a temperate zone like Rhode Island or something like that. So it sort of forces us to remember, there's an instability here that has to do with change, right? And crossing an ocean and knowing and not knowing, your description of not knowing that you weren't going back, that you weren't going home again, brings up another thought, which is it's not really, I'm going to try to get a question out of this. It's more an observation, but I think there's probably a question here. There's something so wonderful about starting with your 6-year-old self, because it almost feels like it's first person, and it's the voice of you as a 6-year-old. You do that so beautifully. It reads young, but not in a weird way. It reads young we're right there with you. We're with this kid, and we want to help her and make her life happy, and we're not sure where we're going with her, but we know that you're telling this story. So your place from which you're telling it is as an adult, and then we get to experience that with you. And as those experiences of yours accrue in our reading experience, we come to see you as a teenager, having to deal with a parent and relatives and other school people and those hideous teachers, and and then the less hideous teachers. And so we have points of, we as readers, as adult readers, we've been through our own variation on that same trajectory, right? It reads almost like an instruction manual, and not like the one you want, like I wish somebody had given this to me all along my journey, right? And I'm glad to get it now. But so there's how to be a girl, how to be a woman, right? How to be a mother, how to be a friend, how to be a daughter, how to be a citizen, how to be an immigrant, how to be a Rhode Islander, how to talk to animals, how to come to terms with the best and worst of our stories and our behavior and our memories. And it really does, it teaches us, even as it's teaching us how to know when to be angry and when to let go of angry, how to know when to take your child and leave and when not to do that, when to give up and let your child sleep with you, when to learn a lesson about leaving a kid in a car, and or dealing with the authority that isn't very sensitive to anything but its own authority. So I guess I'm curious to know, like, how much of that it reads so effortlessly, and for when we came into the this Zoom meeting a little early, and Michael was talking about what it must be like to have this as a memoir out in the world when your family's reading it, and that hadn't even occurred to me. Like there's something so it's universal, but it's also so intimate that I thought, like, no, we're safe. We're just, no one's going to know except me and you and a couple of people who read the book, and that's the bravest thing in the universe. So how did you get this trajectory to manifest itself? And I hope your relatives love it. That's
You're asking some really big questions, Susan. I think, like, my cousins, right, like my generation, who are like, I think they start like 10 years younger and down, they're like, wow, this is cool, thanks for this. But like my mom and not so much. I think that, I didn't do it for that. I did it honestly. I believe in, like, people who like already know me know I'm like a weirdo in this way. Time is not linear, right? And so I really thought I felt like I was doing this, like if I'm healing myself through my which I've always used writing to heal, and it's like if I'm doing this, then I'm sending that healing forward and back and forward. I was really big picture, like this was something bigger than me. So like, yes, I was healing my child self and my teenage self, my young adult self, but I also felt like this is generations, like generations beyond the ones I name. Like I know I name, like I go back for, right, it's like great grandma, but like I had the feeling every time I sat down to work on this is just like so much bigger than that. And I think that's what kind of gave me the courage. And like, as we were talking before the Zoom started, I'm big on astrology, and I'm in Aries, right? Rising and Aries sun. So that's just like all courage all the time. So it's like, was really healing for me to like use writing to channel that courage and that like tenacity into the written word, as opposed to all the physical sort of altercations that I grew up getting into. It was like a healthier outlet. But yeah, it's always super powerful when anyone, especially a woman, a refugee, a mother, like speaks their truth. And there's no way you're going to make people happy doing that. And that wasn't my goal. And I never cared, people can take it or leave it, including my own family. I mean, that's just how it is. There's people who have struggled and are struggling with much bigger and worse situations than I ever had to. And if I can be that example of like, if I could do it, you could also, you know what I mean? Like also heal, then that's great too. So yeah.
Right. Yeah, that's part of the instruction manual, right? How to survive the crazy world. Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. It's really it's making me think. I'll just add one more question here. Although I also want to praise your wonderful details, like Gone with the Wind and dish towels and crayons and other things that I have written down here is really memorable. And again, like the landscape, it anchors us and it keeps us in the real world and it keeps us with you. There's a lot of healing of generations. You take stories from grandmas and great grandmas, and you try to give them back something and revise. And so there is some reimagining and revising of stories and reclaiming myths and looking at them a different way. And that's another gift to the reader, to realize that there's not just one language, there's not just one location, there's not just one politics, and there's not just one story, right? And I think you did that beautifully, and I don't think that's a question, but if you have any thoughts about that, and then I'm gonna invite other people to talk too.
Thank you so much, Susan.
I invite you now to unmute yourselves or pop questions into the chat if you are feeling as though you don't want your voice out there.
Nada, congratulations. I'm so excited that this book is finally out there in the world. That is so exciting. I'm curious about, and wondered if you could talk a little about your process for selecting what moments from your life you wanted to depict for this book, whether there were some that were just obvious choices to include, or maybe others that surprised you, looking back on them in retrospect with how important they were in your life.
That is such a great question. Yeah, so there was like definitely sort of like the top 5, right, that were like super obvious. So like first landing in New York, first being in Situate, like leaving Kuwait during bombing, like they were like clearly obvious ones. But I was surprised. There were some sections that got added on in the last minute, because it was just like a journal entry that I happened to find, and then I like went with it and like kept going. And I was like, oh no, this needs to go in there. So I have like in the teenage section, that chapter about, or like a set section in the chapter about a memory of wandering around in the woods in the 90s with my group of friends in the neighborhood and coming across this new like a newly built or halfway built raised ranch, and how that was like, we had the audacity, I had the audacity just like walk up in this like half built raised ranch, and like it was always something that struck me about that memory. And it wasn't till I journaled about it that I was like, oh, there's something here, because I was like really stubborn about like, because half of my friends like stayed out, they were like scared, and like me and the other half were like, no, we're going in, it's not locked, it's half built, like who cares, let's wander. And it's like struck me because it was like all these like it was such a different feel. Like I'd been around half destructed things before, right? Like seeing Kuwait after the bombing, and like living in my uncle's like flooded basement and having to like pull mattresses out and living like I'd always been living with this like, it's just like this physical space in a certain way. It just felt different. So this physical space looked much like the destruction, but it wasn't. It was intentional creation. And it's just that struck me to see like the connection, like, oh, they look the same, but the feeling's different. So it's like, what is that feeling? So it's like that struck me. And that's when I was like, okay, I have to go back now and look at all my old journals and like revisit and see, because yeah, sometimes you have these like gold mines and they don't strike you in the same way until you like go back.
Any other questions?
Hi, Sarah.
Hi. First of all, I'm like, that was beautiful. And I just got my copy in the mail, so I'm very excited to read it. And this was a great introduction to it. I guess just kind of combining Julia and one of Susan's questions is, I mean, I know you, so I like know your relationship with water and everything, but did you find, so when you were choosing what aspects of your life to write about, did you kind of focus on things that had to do with water, or did you just kind of be like, well, water ends up just being involved in it?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think it was a little bit of both. Yeah, for sure.
Any other questions or thoughts or Rhode Island memories?
Yeah, I would love to go. Can y'all hear me?
Yes,
Yeah.
hi.
Hi, Nada. Hey, folks. Yeah, so grateful to be here. Thank you for gifting the world with your book, Nada. I just got in the mail yesterday, so I'm gonna try to dig into it as soon as possible. Yeah, and but always been appreciative to be in movement and in community and in friendship with you and your family, particularly and especially as comrades as well. So thank you. You know, you read that chapter, and I can't wait to go back and reread it. And I think what really resonated with me was just sort of the experience of being in a new place, right? And especially be like sort of the refugee child experience, immigrant child experience. It made me remember of just sort of picking up the details or like seeing new things, and experiencing it. And you captured it so well. I think it's also really important and so amazing how you tied it also into the indigenous and local history, right, of where you landed. And that's something I think about all the time as a refugee myself, right, who came here about 5 years old. I don't have any memories of actually, my first earliest memory was being like, wow, the US is really fucking cold. Excuse me.
Yeah.
Yeah, my people are tropical jungle people.
Yeah.
And so, and I think as I became politicized and learned more and understood more, both sort of from my lived experience as a refugee kid growing up, about how this country actually doesn't like me or want me here, but actually did the things that brought me here in the first place, right? So, anyways, all those sort of contradictions. And then I think about, and part of my politicization also was trying to understand, like, oh, okay, if I can't be on my land, then whose land I'm on, right? And so I still struggle with it and thinking about, even doing all the community organizing and like sort of like freedom liberation work that we do, like what does it mean? I would love to hear your thoughts about how you think about and how do you, I don't know what the word is, how do you think about and how do you reconcile what it means to be a refugee on stolen land, because you can't really go back home. I mean, you can now, but back then we couldn't. But so, anyways, it's also complicated. I'm trying to say, but I would love. I mean, have you ever thought about it, or because I think you lay it out so well in that chapter.
Thank you so much. That was one of the first things when we came to Rhode Island. My mom was actually like really good at pointing out, like, hey, we're gonna watch the first episode of Roots. You're gonna know what's going on with African Americans. You're going to know that this is Narragansett land. We're gonna go to powwows. Like, she just did that. And I think part of it is in the Middle East in the 60s and 70s when she was growing up, and I do talk a little bit about this in the book, is that her generation was so starkly different than my grandmother's, because they were in my grandmother's time, it was under British colonization. And it was like a lot of places under British colonization, it was like the lighter skin the better, like you got to look like this, you got to act like that. By the time my mom's generation was coming up, actually it was the Black Power movement had traveled to the Middle East, and it was this like pan-Arab thing, right, that like swept up the Middle East, and it was very similar to the Pan-African. I mean, I think it colored her view and made sure that I was raised with that awareness. So growing up here, that was always a part of how I viewed things. And also being like, a refugee, like from people, like, they stole our, from coming from a land that was stolen. It's like, it's amazing the similarities. Like we just, the indigenous friends that I ended up making over time, it will never cease to amaze me. This is an ocean separating, and like a whole continent separating indigenous Native Americans from like Arab Muslims, like, but there's so many rituals that are so similar. And I'm always struck. So like, I remember going to a powwow in like upstate New York, and it was like indigenous folks from like the Northeast. And I've been places where they've saged, and they're saging, but they're literally following this pattern of saging their bodies the way that we would do wudu, like before praying, like 3 times around each wrist, around each ankle, like the whole I was like baffled. I'm like, what? But it's just little things like that. It's just like indigenous people all over the world have very similar practices. So it's like once you start seeing it, now you start seeing it in other places and ways and stuff. So our struggles are 100% connected. Our just having that experience of living so close to the land is super connected. And yeah, it goes into obviously everything I do with my education work, right? And when I'm with young people and whatever. So it's just, yeah, it'll never not be connected. And I just think it's like, it really is this belief in something bigger than me, because it's like, yes, it's complicated. Sometimes it doesn't make sense, but obviously there was some like I landed here for a reason, you landed here for a reason, right? Like and it's like we're going to do what we can where we're at. And I think that's maybe a generational thing too, because it's like I noticed with my mom's generation, there is that connection, there's that knowledge, but it doesn't quite go as deep as like my generation. And I think part of it is just sort of like they're so tired and exhausted, and they've been like just like beat down by so many different paths in the system that they're just kind of like, I don't know, it's different. So for us, it is sort of like, yeah, we're here and we're just gonna keep fighting, and this is just our life. So I don't know if that answers it, but
Thank you. I would love to talk some more and connect more about that.
you're welcome.
All right. Well, Nada, I have a question for you, and it is, I am told, the question we writers dread most. What next?
I love that. I could see why folks might dread it. And maybe, yeah, but honestly, I think that's a great one. I have like 4 different projects in there, so I am kind of working on a part 2, because I did go to Amman in 2021, just me and my husband, to reunite for the first time in 30 years with my dad's family. So that's obviously a book. So I'm working on that. And it does still have like flashbacks from childhood and young adulthood and things. It's just gonna kind of take on a different theme. Like I'm sort of with water a little bit, but it's like a different theme. Just, yeah. So there's that nonfiction. And then I have like a historic fiction like young adult thing that I've been researching for a long time, that's super local, like based in Rhode Island. Yeah, so there's like a million things. What I would love is an agent that would deal with me and the fact that there's fiction and nonfiction coming out of me. So yeah, that would be sort of the next thing, is trying to focus on querying, like figuring out, all right, what's the target for the next one, what's like closest to be complete, and try to get an agent for that.
Well, yeah, I mean, you're too big and too creative to be contained. So you may need a team of agents.
Right,
And
that's cool. I'll manage the team. I
yeah,
manage these 3 kids, you know. Same thing.
yeah, maybe you can get the kids to be your agents. They've got energy, right? I am so intrigued by both of those projects. I Not enough books are written about Rhode Island. It is a very special place.
It's very
Uh,
storied, yes.
yeah, but also, finding out this next step in your personal story, this next stage, is really intriguing. I absolutely can't wait for that. So no pressure, just when you're ready, get them out there. But I think I speak for all of us when I say we are really all incredibly excited and really happy to celebrate this first of what I suspect will be many books of yours.
Thank you so much. That's really amazing, and it warms my heart to hear that support.
Yeah. Now, I mean, I've read your stuff. I've heard you read. I can tell anybody who needs to hear it that the good stuff is there. That you do the work. So if you need a reference for any of these agents, you'll know where to find me.
That's amazing. Thank you.